So thankful to be here this morning, to be able to stand before you and preach a sermon from God's Word. I'm thankful for God giving me the measure of health to be able to do so. And there's just so many things we often take for granted in this life, being able to get up and breathe the fresh air and tread upon the earth and so many things like that. I'm so thankful for this morning. We were talking about in Bible class about the difference between sinners and saints is that saints are forgiven. And that, I'm thankful that I can be a part of an institution, a spiritual institution such as the Lord's Church, where I can live my life with my faltering, my fumbles and my mistakes and things like that, and still be forgiven and be surrounded by people who are doing the same thing. We're all on a journey, and our goal is heaven. So it's just a great thing to be able to be in the church where God's grace is, and you don't have to depend on your own works. You don't have to depend upon your own accomplishments. You're dependent upon grace every day. So I'm thankful for that. The sermon this morning is going to be on 2 Kings chapter 5 with looking at Naaman. I want to continue looking at some things in this account here. So if you want to go ahead and turn to 2 Kings chapter 5, I'll be with you there momentarily. So we looked at the first part of this story, and we see where this Gentile king, he is having trouble. He has a problem. He's a leper, and so we see that he's in Syria, and there's this little Israelite maid who understands the problem, and she says, "Well, if he was in Israel, he could be healed. There's a prophet in Israel who could heal the leper." And we saw where Naaman goes down and Elisha gives the instructions to simply go and dip in the Jordan River 7 times and he would be cleansed. And we see where Naaman had a problem with that. He had his own preconceived ideas about the way that God should do things, the way Jehovah should do things, and worshiping in his pagan idolatry, he saw things a different way. But we learned the lesson from that story that whenever God gives the cure, and our problem is sin. When God gives us the cure, we just need to listen to what He says and do what God's cure is. It's that simple. Whether we think it's too big or too much or too small, we just need to do what the Word says. And when we do that, we will be pleasing in God's sight, and we'll get the cure that God has offered. And although we saw those lessons there last week, the real point in that story is that little Israelite maid down in Syria was letting her light shine in a way that was beyond belief, as far as she's living under the old covenant where Jesus had not been on the scene yet. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 to 16, "Ye are the salt of the earth. But if the salt hath lost its savour, wherewithal shall it be salted? It's thenceforth good for nothing, to be cast out and trodden under the foot of men." He says, "Ye are the light of the world. A city that set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it gives light to all that are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and be brought to glorify your Father which is in heaven." Now Jesus said that in the Sermon on the Mount thousands of years after this little Israelite maid was ever alive. But before Jesus ever said that, she had that principle in her life where she was shining a light down in Syria. And it'd be easy for her to become bitter and say, "You know what? He's a leper. That's good enough for him. He's got me down here captured. I'm a slave down here in Syria. I'm away from my home. I'm away from my family," and just to become bitter. But she didn't let the external circumstances of her life determine what she was going to do. She said no. She understood that the answer to her problems was to cultivate love, not to cultivate hate. And so we see that there's a great story there that gives us a great principle on how to let our light shine. Now this morning in 2 Kings chapter 5, I want to look at the second half of the story. So we only, if anybody's familiar with Paul Harvey, where he would talk about the rest of the story or whatever, so Some of you may know what that is. I barely know what it is, okay? But I remember when I was a kid and then riding in the car, I could listen on the radio and we'd listen to that voice, Paul Hardy. You know, you can't get that voice out of your head. He just had that voice for radio. We're going to see the rest of the story this morning. And the main character this morning is going to be Elisha's servant, who is named Gehazi. So he's going to be the main guy. We're going to look and see some choices he made and some things he did, and see if we can learn some lessons from what he did this morning. So the first point this morning is making impression. In 2 Kings chapter 5, beginning in verse 15, speaking of Naaman, it says, "He returned to the man of God," that is Elisha, "he and all his company, and came and stood before him, and he said, Behold, now I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. Now therefore I pray thee, take a blessing of thy servant. But he said, As the Lord liveth before whom I stand, I will receive none. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. And Naaman said, Shall there not then, I pray thee, be given to thy servant 2 mules burden of earth? For thy servant will henceforth offer neither burnt offering nor sacrifice unto other gods, but unto the Lord. And this thing the Lord pardon thy servant, that when my master goeth into the house of Naaman to worship there, and he leaneth on my hand, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, when I bow down myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon thy servant in this thing. And he said unto him, Go in peace. So he departed from him a little way. So we see here that Naaman gets the cleansing. He was a leper. He goes down and dips in the Jordan River because that's what the prophet said, and he gets the cure. Okay, so Naaman is very thankful and very grateful here. And so what he did to go to Elisha and say, I want to pay for what you've done. I want to pay for the healing that I've received. Now that was a good gesture on Naaman's part. You see, he's used to living in an atmosphere where they worship pagan gods, and the way that they lived was, money was a very important thing, and they would pay off people and pay people for different things. But Elisha, he lived in such a way, and he wanted his life to be such a way that he could just live above reproach no matter what. So he said, I don't want to receive the money. Now, would it have been necessarily wrong for him to receive the money? Not necessarily, but the thing about it is he wanted to make sure that he lived above reproach. He wanted to go out of his way to live above reproach. And that's a good lesson for us today. We need to make sure there's some things we may do today that it may not necessarily be sinful, but just to make sure that our name is not dragged through the mud and our reputation is at stake, we need to make sure that we live in a way that there can be no question about our character. It's good to just make preparation beforehand. If you see something, we need to have some foresight. If you're going to be, if there's a chance where you might be in an area that's known for, immoral practices or things like that, it's best to stay away from that if you can, and things like that. So Elisha, he lived in that way, and he wanted to make sure that there was no question about the purpose and what he was doing. So he was only concerned with God getting the glory. He wasn't concerned with getting paid money and receiving the silver and gold from this man, from this Gentile king. So we see that Elisha, he wanted to make sure that he made an impression, a lasting impression upon this king. That way when he goes back to his hometown, there's nothing he could say that Elisha, he would be above reproach. Now there's a couple of other people in the Old Testament that chose this same route and they live by this same principle. Look in Genesis chapter 14. In Genesis chapter 14, we have the account of Abraham, where he goes to war. His nephew Lot is captured by this Canaanite king, and Abraham takes his servants. He gets everybody loaded up, he gets everybody armed up and ready to go to war. They go down there and they go to battle with these kings so he can be able to rescue Lot. Now look what happens at the end of this battle in Genesis chapter 14, beginning in verse 17. It says, And the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Kedorlaomer, and of the kings that were with him at the valley of Sheba. which is the king's dale. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemy into thine hand. And he gave him tithes of all. Now listen to this. And the king of Sodom said unto Abram, Give me the persons, and take the goods to thyself. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich. So we see there that Abraham, when he comes back from this battle, this victory, the king of Sodom, he's impressed, and he says, Look, just give me the men that you rescued, and you can have all the spoil. But Abraham said, No, I don't want to do that. I don't want any question in anybody's mind about what my motive was. You know, would it necessarily have been wrong? Now he made a vow here. It says he made a vow. He said, I lifted my hand. I'm not going to take anything from the kings. But you got to ask yourself, would it have been wrong for Elisha to take that money from Naaman? Would it have been wrong necessarily for Abraham to take that money? Not necessarily, but the thing is, he wanted to make sure that nobody could misunderstand what it was all about. So whenever Abraham got done with this battle, this king of Sodom here, he would understand, this man right here, he worships the one true living God. He has higher values that he lives for. He has priorities in life that other people don't have. And that would leave a lasting impression on the people. So we see there that Abraham is an example of that. Then there's another example of a man named Ezra. Look in Ezra chapter 8. Ezra chapter 8. Kind of about in the middle of the Bible there. In Ezra chapter 8, we see where Ezra is, he has the task of rebuilding the temple, getting everybody on board. The temple's been destroyed, and they're trying to get things back going. They're trying to come back out of captivity and get the program going again. And listen to what it says. I can get my verse here. Here it is. Beginning in verse 21. Now this is Ezra, and he's talking about what he said to the king there. He says, Then I proclaimed a fast there at the river Ahava, that we might afflict ourselves before our God to seek of him the right way for us, and for our little ones, and for all our substance. For I was ashamed to require of the king a band of soldiers and horsemen to help us against the enemy, because we have spoken to the king, saying, The hand of our God is upon all them for good that seek him, but his power and his wrath is against all them that forsake him. So we fasted and besought God for this, and he was entreated of us. So Ezra, when he was getting ready to rebuild the temple and getting everybody on the program and getting everybody ready to do that, he said, I was ashamed to even ask the king, this was a Gentile king, he said, I didn't want to ask him for a band of soldiers to protect us from the enemy. Because he had already told the king, look, God is with us. If you'll give us permission, if you'll give us leeway to do this, we want to rebuild the temple and get things going again. And, would it have been wrong for him to ask the king, to have some protection? Not necessarily. But you see, Ezra, he lived in such a way that he wanted everybody to understand that I depend upon God. I do not depend upon the same thing that worldly people do. And I don't live my life that way. So we see there with Abraham and Ezra that they were a lot like Elisha. Elisha didn't want anybody questioning in their mind, well, why did he do that? Did he just heal that man so he could get paid money just because he was greedy or something like that? No, he did it because he wanted God to get the glory. So we see that the first point this morning is making impressions. Back to 2 Kings chapter 5. The second point this morning is temptations. Now here we're going to see what I was talking about. We're going to look at this man Gehazi. We're going to look at some choices he made, and we're going to see how it turns out for him. Beginning of verse 20, it says, But Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said, Behold, my master has spared Naaman the Syrian, and not receiving at his hands that which he brought. but as the Lord liveth, I will run after him and take somewhat of him. So Gehazi followed after Naaman, and when Naaman saw him running after him, he lighted down off his chariot to meet him and said, Is all well? And he said, All is well. My master has sent me, saying, Behold, even now there be come to me from Mount Ephraim 2 young men of the sons of the prophets. Give them, I pray thee, a talent of silver and 2 changes of raiment. And Naaman said, Be content, take 2 talents. And he urged him and bound 2 talents of silver in 2 bags and with 2 changes of garments, and laid them upon his 2 servants. And they bare them before him. And when he came to the tower, he took them from their hand and bestowed them in the house, and he let the men go, and they departed. So we see here the problem with Gehazi. Naaman comes to Elisha and says, Look, I want to offer you silver and gold. I've got healing and I'm grateful. I want to give that to you. Elisha says, No, there's more at stake here than money and silver and gold right now. God's honor is at stake. I want to make sure that's number one. But you see, as all this is happening, Gehazi is off in the distance and he's eavesdropping. He's hearing what's going on. He sees what's happening. He sees that Elisha refuses the money, and he thinks to himself, you know what? Now that Elisha's not around, maybe I should go after Naaman and see if I can get that silver and that gold. And this is exactly what happens. This is exactly what happens with us sometimes. Sin is a temptation. It starts as a seed thought. It starts as just something small. And the thing about it is, it's not coming from God. We can't blame it on God. Sin is coming from Satan. And whenever we're tempted, we need to be careful that it starts as little thoughts like that. James says in James chapter 1, beginning in verse 13, Let no man say, when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. But every man is tempted when he is enticed, and when sin is finished, it bringeth forth death. So we see there that whenever we're tempted, it's not, God is not the source of temptation. He's not versed in evil. He's never known sin. 1 John chapter 1 verse 5 says, God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. So we see there, anytime that we're tempted to do something, anytime we have that little thought in our mind that says, yeah, go ahead. It won't hurt. It's okay. You know, because that's what happened to Gehazi. He's thinking, well, Elisha refused the money. Well, was it going to hurt? What's it going to hurt if I go after and get the money? So we see there that he does that. Now, we also see here that one sin leads to another. We see there in verse, let's see here, verse 22, that Gehazi, he lies to Naaman. When he catches back up with Naaman to ask him about the money, he says, yeah, my master, talking about Elisha, there's two sons of the prophets that need clothes, they need money. So Elisha never said that. So he basically lied to Naaman about the money. But we see there that Naaman goes ahead and believes him and gives him the money anyways. So we see that we need to understand that materialism and covetousness is a very dangerous sin. God, He does not, He warns all through the Bible about this sin of materialism and covetousness. Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 11, Dearly beloved, as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. And so we see there, whenever we have unhealthy desires for money, material things like that, it just causes problems in our spiritual life. Listen to what Paul says to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6. If I can get my verse here. 1 Timothy chapter 6, beginning in verse 5. Now here, Paul is writing to a young preacher, and he's trying to explain some things about materialism and money and the dangers of what that can do. He says, beginning in verse 5, Perverse disputings of men, corrupt minds, and destitute of truth, supposing that gain is godliness. From such withdraw thyself. But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and raiment, let us be therewith content. But they that will be rich will fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith, and pierced them through with many sorrows. But thou, O man of God, flee these things, and follow after righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, and meekness. So we see here that Paul tells Timothy the love of money is the root of all evil. He doesn't say that money is evil. We have to have money to survive. We have to have money to get along in this world. We have to have foresight to be able to make plans and make a living. You know, it's like when Jesus said, take no thought for your life, what you should put on, what you should eat, and so on. He didn't say don't make any plans, don't work. What he's saying is make me first in your life, make me your number one priority, and everything else will fall into place. You won't be living and running headlong after material things and thinking that your life is all summed up in money and food and lands and houses, because that's a miserable way to live. So Jesus is trying to help us there to be content with spiritual things, and that's what Paul is telling Timothy. Be careful about the love of money, which is what Gehazi, that's what his problem was. So back to 2 Kings chapter 5. I know I'm kind of moving around a lot this morning. Just bear with me here. So we see here that Gehazi, his problem was he was materialistic, he was greedy, and after Elisha had already settled the matter, he said, no, we're not going to receive any money. He goes ahead and goes behind Elisha's back and runs after Naaman and tries to get the money. And of course he succeeds in that. So we've seen first of all this morning that making impressions is important. Elisha wanted it to be understood why he was doing what he was doing. We see the second point is that temptations are dangerous and to be careful about that. And finally, the last point this morning is consequences. Listen to what happens beginning in verse 25. It says, but he went in and stood before his master. And Elisha said unto him, whence comest thou, Gehazi? And he said, thy servant went no whither. And he said unto him, went not mine heart with thee when the man turned again from his chariot to meet thee? Is it a time to receive money, and to receive garments, and olive yards, and vineyards, and sheep, and oxen, and men servants, and maid servants? The leprosy therefore of Naaman shall cleave unto thee, and unto thy seed forever. And he went out from his presence a leper, white as snow. So this was no small matter. This was not something that he could just slough off. It's not a big deal. The very thing that he did, the very leprosy that was from Naaman would cling to him. He would be a leper now. And you got to remember, Gehazi, he's a prophet. He's a son of the prophets. He's in the school of the prophets, if you will. So he's a protege of Elisha. But it doesn't matter. He's already made the choice. He's already went behind Elisha's back and been greedy. And we see there that sin has its consequences. And this thing where Elisha calls him on the carpet, this is similar to another account we have in the New Testament. Does this remind you of anything? In Acts chapter 5, where Ananias and Sapphira, they held the money back, and Peter, who was an apostle, having that miraculous ability, was able to, when it came to religious and spiritual matters, he could read the hearts of men. And he asked Ananias and Sapphira, did you sell the land for so much? And they lied about it. You see, you might read that and wonder, what's the big deal? It's just a little white lie. The problem was, it was the circumstances under which they were lying. They were using the Lord's money here. And so whenever Peter asked them about that property, they were trying to say, yeah, we sold it for so much, and we gave all to the Lord, but they were keeping back the money. And Peter said, when it was your property, was it not yours to do what you wanted to? That they could have sold it and done whatever they wanted and kept the money, but the problem was they lied about it. They said, this is for the Lord. This is our contribution to the Lord. And Peter said, you're lying about that. And so they were both struck dead immediately. And we see there that that's God's attitude towards covetousness. It's a dangerous sin. The first sin after Israel entered into the land of Canaan was covetousness with Achan in the book of Joshua. And I'm not going to go back there. Just remember that whenever they won that big battle of Jericho, that huge city with all the walls and all that stuff, they won that battle. Well, after that, they went to the battle of Ai, to the small town of Ai, and they couldn't win because Achan, when they went in there to get the spoils, he coveted the gold and silver and took it and hid it in his tent. And as long as that sin was in the tent, as long as that sin was in the camp, they couldn't defend their enemy, defeat their enemies. And we see there the end of Achan. They brought him and his whole family out to the middle of the camp and they stoned him. So there was a death immediately because of this covetousness. So the first sin after entering the land of Canaan and the first major sin we see in the church is covetousness, and both instances have immediate death as a consequence. So we see there that Naaman's leprosy, it passed to Gehazi. He suffered the consequences. And this reminds me of that very good saying I've seen. I believe the first time I saw it was on Facebook or something, some social media, but it rings true. It says, sin takes you further than you want to go, it keeps you longer than you want to stay, and costs you more than you want to pay. You can mark it down every time that we decide, I'll just do this a little bit, we're deceiving ourselves, we're fooling ourselves. Sin is serious anytime, any place. Jesus said, if your right hand offends you, cut it off. If your eye offends you, pluck it out. Now, of course, he didn't literally mean to do that, but he's trying to show this is how serious sin is. If you went to the doctor and they said an eye had to come out, would you go away laughing about that? You know, if they said a hand had to come off, would we think that was a laughing matter or just something small? No, we would think that's a serious matter. This is serious business. So Jesus, when he said that, he's wanting us to understand sin is serious business, and it's any time, any place. So it never adds to our life. It always subtracts. It never adds quality to our life. But that's the way it comes off. Satan, he makes sin appealing. He creates the illusion that it's going to give value to our life, that it's going to add quality to our life, but it never does. It always hurts us. It always subtracts from the quality of our life. I hope that some of these things we've looked at in the lesson of Naaman can help us. These stories in the Old Testament, I love them. They're chock full of good lessons and principles for us to imbibe into our life to help us be better servants of God. If you're here this morning and you're not a servant of God, you can do that. You can obey the simple plan of salvation by repentance, confession, and baptism. If you're a Christian and you strayed off the narrow path, you can be brought back into the fold by repentance, confession, and prayer. Whatever your need is, we're here for you this morning. Would you please come as together we stand and sing.
Days are filled with sorrow and care.